She lived across the bay in old money East Egg.
The Great Gatsby was a novel published in 1925 by F. Scott Fitzgerald just after the First World War, as well as the beginning of the Prohibition. At the beginning of the novel, we, the audience, are introduced to our narrator, Nick Carraway. Nick is relatively naive and works as a bondman in Manhattan. One summer, Nick rents a home in an area where new money is separated by old money based on the side of the bay you live on. Nick first introduces the reader to Tom Buchanan, a man married to Nick's cousin Daisy. Tom is a stereotypical bully who is both sexist and racist. He also comes from a wealthy family, placing him in the East Egg. He's shown to have double standards throughout the novel and to be one to confront others. Tom is also known to be relatively violent as well as selfish. Tom's foil is the protagonist, Jay Gatsby. Gatsby comes from a farm in North Dakota and only finds his claim to fortune later through illegal means.
Oh, you must know Gatsby.
He hosts parties every Saturday night and hopes to attract his first love, Daisy, who is also Tom's wife. And despite the popularity of said socials, no one knows who he is or where he came from. Gatsby is shown to be passive as well as reckless, shown by his inability to go talk to Daisy, the woman he fell in love with years ago, on his own, but the lack of fear at confessing his adorations. Lastly, there's Daisy Buchanan. Daisy is a wise woman, but due to her gender in the time period, she hides it, which is shown in the beginning of the book when she says, "And I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool," in reference to giving birth to her daughter. Daisy had fallen in love with Gatsby when he was training to be an officer in his youth and promised to wait for him, but due to her deeper desire to be loved, Daisy backs out on her word and marries Tom Buchanan. The first turning point in The Great Gatsby is when we are introduced to Tom's mistress, Myrtle Wilson. This event shows how despite how normal the Buchanan marriage appears, there are underlying secrets. Tom isn't really the husband figure of the time and instead seems far more infatuated with Myrtle, but unable to make a commitment, going as far to say Daisy's religion is against divorce, when really, Tom's hesitant to tarnish his good name, seeing as it was taboo at the time to get divorced. Towards Chapter 1, the first apparent use of symbolism appears. This shows up when Gatsby can be seen reaching towards the other side of the bay, which causes Nick to notice a light placed where Daisy lives. When the man puts his hand down and leaves, Nick says, "When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness." The light here can represent two things. The first one is hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Gatsby is reaching out towards the woman he harbors feelings for, but it is out of his reach, which brings the theme of forbidden love. The light can also be seen as how Gatsby affects Nick, seen as a guide, which can also be foreshadowing, as in the last chapter of The Great Gatsby, Gatsby dies. His own light goes out metaphorically. Once the gang returns back from seeing Myrtle, Nick attends a party held by Gatsby, as he had been hand-delivered an invitation, and learns that despite his reputation, no one knows what Gatsby is. Nick himself only meets Gatsby when a man asks if he served in the war, and then reveals himself to be Gatsby. This moment is the beginning of the friendship between the two men. At the party, we are introduced to the tension individual versus society, something that parallels To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee and Tom Robinson's case.
I still haven't met Mr. Gatsby. No one's met him. They say he's third cousin to the Kaiser and second cousin to the devil. I'm afraid I haven't been a very good host, old sport.
At Gatsby's party, there are rumors floating left and right about just where the host came from. Some women even claim he's related to the Kaiser, a hefty accusation seeing as the Great War had just ended. Although less severe than being accused of rape, Gatsby can seem similarly to Tom due to the allegations against the two of them and the seeming distrust towards them. At the party, Gatsby learns that Nick is related to Daisy and makes plans to hang out or run with each other more. This later leads to Nick inviting both Gatsby and Daisy into his home in the West Egg at Gatsby's request. The two hit it off immediately, sharing how they met years before, and a sort of affair starts between the two. Later in the novel, Tom catches wind of this, and that is when his double standards are revealed, becoming enraged that Daisy has not kept her loyalty, though Tom has been doing the same thing for much longer with Myrtle Wilson. The next major event is when Tom, Daisy, Gatsby, Jordan, a friend Nick met at the party, and Nick go to Manhattan on a hot summer day. Daisy rides with Gatsby in Tom's car on their way, which confirms any suspicions Tom may have had about the two. And while they stop in a hotel room to escape the heat, Gatsby begins to urge Daisy to tell her husband she had never loved him. This exposes Gatsby to not be as innocent as he may seem, as though he deserves Daisy's affection more than Tom. This can be shown when he says, "Daisy, that's all over now. Just tell him the truth, that you never loved him. It's all wiped out forever." This, understandably, angers Tom, and when he sends Daisy back to the West Egg, Gatsby goes with her in his own car. When Jordan, Nick, and Tom head on back, they're met with a horrifying scene. Myrtle had been hit by a yellow car, Gatsby's car. This is the beginning of the end for Gatsby, as he plans to take the blame for Daisy, who had been the one driving. The death causes Daisy and Tom to go MIA, leaving Gatsby without the woman who supposedly loved him. This also makes Myrtle's own husband, George, filled with vengeance, though he had learned of his wife's infidelity beforehand. George then goes on a revenge-seeking journey, which ends in Gatsby being shot. George Wilson draws a resemblance to Mr. Bob Ewell in To Kill a Mockingbird and Tybalt from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. George takes revenge on the killer of his wife, similar to how Ewell wants to kill Atticus Finch for making a fool of the Ewell name, or how Tybalt finds that Romeo has disgraced him by inadvertently making Lord Capulet scold his nephew at their party. The last important event of The Great Gatsby is Gatsby's own funeral. Throughout the novel, Gatsby is seen to be a pretty popular party man, but at Gatsby's funeral we find there are only 6 or 7 people in attendance. Nick, Mr. Gatz, Gatsby's father, a man who frequented the parties Gatsby threw, and 4 or 5 former workers of Gatsby. This shows the shallowness of the wealthy in the 1920s America. All those who had attended Jay Gatsby's parties were just using him for what he had and what he served to the public. The scene also uses pathetic fallacy to enforce the melancholic, somber tone, a huge contrast to the relative neutrality of the rest of the book. Gatsby's death opens Nick's eyes to see how lonely his friend must have been for his life. With that, the book ends on an open note, leaving the reader to imagine what Nick's life may be after his friend's death and after his cousin goes MIA with a man he knew from college.
He had come such a long way, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. But he did not know that it was already behind him. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.